The heat over at CNN continues. The company recuperating following the firing of CEO Chris Licht now faces drama on the COVID lockdown front. Later this month, the company will begin talks with former CNN host Chris Cuomo over his claim that he was wrongly terminated from the network back in 2021, Semaphore reports. According to Semaphore, the proceeding includes previously undisclosed text messages in which CNN's parent company, then known as Warner Media, sought to use the network's close relationship with former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to advance Warner's commercial interests.
So the September 22nd, 2020 texts are reportedly between Governor Andrew Cuomo and CNN's then chief marketing officer, Allison Gollust, who left Governor Andrew Cuomo's office years prior, but remained in contact with the former governor while working for CNN, helping to coordinate his appearances. Now, according to Semaphore, Gollust messaged a request that Andrew Cuomo speak with Warner Media's studio chief, Ann Sarnoff, quote, "She's bummed you don't open theaters in New York, but perhaps you can hear her out." The following day, Cuomo reportedly called Sarnoff, who lobbied the governor to loosen restrictions on movie theaters, according to someone familiar with the exchange. As the Semaphore report notes, Cuomo has spoken at length about the hurt and embarrassment he felt after he was fired from CNN. This is Chris Cuomo now, not Andrew Cuomo. In an interview earlier this year, he told Anthony Scaramucci that he is also suing his publisher for scrapping his book after his ouster. Okay, let me explain this again because it's somewhat complicated. So Andrew Cuomo and Chris Cuomo is an anchor at CNN. He now works for News Nation, has the same parent company, Nexstar, as The Hill. He's suing CNN for wrongful termination. As a result of that lawsuit, a little bit like the Fox situation with Dominion, we're getting some interesting text messages, including one from Allison Gollust, who is an executive at CNN. You probably remember her name. She's the one who had a romantic situation with Jeff Zucker, the then president of CNN, that has led to both of their departures. But she also worked for Andrew Cuomo before that in the governor's office, so she kind of had a relationship with him. So at the time period, this is September 2020, at the time period that we're all very locked down and movies are closed everywhere, CNN's parent company, Warner, movie theater company, that had a big Christopher Nolan movie coming out, Tenet. While CNN on air is saying, holding the lockdown line, behind the scenes, the company is like, man, we want movie theaters reopened in New York. And she, while the programming is all pro-lockdown, she is texting Andrew Cuomo to set up a meeting for them to lobby for the movie theaters to reopen so that their big movie, Tenet, which I saw, it was terrible. It's the first Christopher Nolan movie I have not liked. I love Christopher Nolan, all his movies. Tenet sucked.
Yeah, I heard that.
So bad. One of the worst movies I've ever seen. Anyway, I could talk about that the rest of the segment. Lobbying to have movie theaters open. Yeah. So really, this is a COVID hypocrisy story with a little bit having to do with the very close relationship that the network had with the governor, Andrew Cuomo, during the time. Obviously, the controversy about him being interviewed on air and all that. But this was an interesting one. There's a great scoop, by the way, in case we bury the lead, by Max Tawney, who's a reporter for Semaphore.
Yeah, look, I think these kinds of stories are really fascinating because so much of the posture of people who have been skeptical of various COVID interventions, whether it is masking or vaccine mandates or closed down retail, et cetera, have been rightly skeptical about the role that the CDC plays in being very unclear about what the health measures dictated, what should we do from a public health perspective, and all of the censorship and things that happen as a consequence. I think that's right to be skeptical of that institution, especially given that they've now been proven to have made some mistakes, either in good faith or not. What has always troubled me is that none of that skepticism came down on the side of what corporations' incentives were to reopen, even if that also didn't align with what the public health recommendations would have been at the time. So in this case, you have a company that both owns the news and also owns these movie theaters having an internal conflict of interest, right, where on one hand they are very much financially
has
the
movies
theaters.
they want to do well. Movie theaters they don't.
Yeah, the movies they want to do well. Right. But that they have a different incentive that is again completely uncoupled from any public health obligations to just keep people in their seats and make money at these movie theaters. And the truth can be somewhere in the middle. We've discovered the truth is somewhere in the middle. COVID was a virus. It continues to be a virus. It continues to be a virus that kills people. And especially at that time, in the fall of 2020, before vaccines, the idea that we should be encouraging people to go and sit in crowded theaters and huff each other's air is dubious at best. Because people, before the vaccines, even young, healthy people were dying of the disease or becoming very injured and hospitalized in a way that put an enormous burden on our public health resources, on our hospitals and our essential workers. But there's very little skepticism. There seemed to be a complete credulity with which some people who are, I think appropriately skeptical of the CDC and those kinds of health measures, aligning with corporate interests who were forcing reopen, not because they thought it was safe, but because they wanted to make money. And I think you got to be skeptical across the board.
Well, I mean, yes, they want to reopen to make money. You're absolutely right. But I don't think these are exactly equivalent, because if the government forces things to be closed, they're taking you, the consumer's choices away. Whereas if the company has it open, that you could still choose to stay home.
Yeah.
You could say that's not a safe environment for me.
That's fair.
Or you could go and wear a mask.
Yeah.
You could factor in what the CDC thinks with is it?
Right,
I don't know that we now think that movie. Right.
It's not that I'm saying they're equivalent.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there's this world in which it's like the government should be hands off. Okay, the government should be hands off, but the government is also designing liability shields so that they don't have to be responsible for either the negative implications of vaccine injury. That's one bucket. People are very skeptical about that. They also have liability shields. We saw this in New York about people's policies with respect to reopening, not exposing them to liability if their employees were to get sick, et cetera. So why is it, again, it's not that they have to be equivalent or that the implications of a government doing something versus the private industry doing something are the same. I think that you're completely right about that. But at the end of the day, there was a real sincerity with which any business person wanting to make any kind of decision was perceived as, well, this must be the right thing to do and in the public interest, just in a reflexive way, because there was so much criticism of what the government was doing, which seemed to be obviously not in the public interest. And I think the reality was somewhere in between, and people just have to make their independent kind of decisions about what best way to look out for their own health, because there are incentives everywhere that are not aligned with the incentives of individuals who are trying to keep their families safe and alive.
Right. Yeah, you should factor in all the information and you should consider what motivations the government actors have, what motivations the corporate actors have, the activists, the advisors, everyone, and make your own, best decision about what's right for you. And what's right for you might be different from what's right for a bunch of other people. And that, I wish that had been more of the attitude all the way through. I think we've seen some studies that have called into question the effectiveness of lockdowns, which is not because everybody staying at home had no effect, but because people, regardless of whether it was forced on people or not, a lot of people were capable of making good, smart choices based on the information they had. So it wasn't necessary to give the government the power to do that. We could have bad, consequences down the road, I think, for giving the government that kind of broad power to just shut things down when it feels like it. But people should be empowered to, in a responsible society, make good choices for their own health. And I mean, the guidance on masking was so confused the whole time through. If they had said maybe we could have had a more open, a less lockdown society if the government had actually recommended the good
higher quality masks.
Right.
And maybe
they said they didn't say that.
And, yeah.
Well, right. I mean, they would have had to admit that you needed the higher quality mask, right? For a long time throughout the pandemic, it was like, no, any mask is good. Well, first it was don't bother. Then it was
there were supply
any
chain
mask.
issues. So
but that's not why they were saying that.
Well, there were many cycles of this. First, they said that they didn't want to recommend masks because there were supply chain issues, and they wanted to keep the masks that they had for medical workers, for frontline workers. Then there was this admission that masking does work, but there wasn't this follow-up of which masks are better than other masks,
right.
Which I don't know what motivated that.
There was a long period where a lot of health officials, Fauci and everyone else, said
all masks
just having a mask is the major thing you should is.
But that's also, I mean, there's a perverse incentive there as well, where if you give people a false sense of security from masking, then you can also advocate for reopening and getting people back into the streets because they believe they are protected, regardless of whether or not they are.
They said you should wear a mask. In fact, you should have to wear a mask, and in a lot of places, they still kept things shut down. But
Sure. Well, it was a real mixed bag, and it's worth noting that it's still the case that the money that was allotted to improve respiration in schools largely was not implemented. We just had this air crisis last week where this kind of technology could have again come into play. The masks that might have been having dust motes grow on them in your closet, Robby, were perhaps whipped out again last week because of the wildfire.
I started the fire because I was burning all my masks. Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Look, I'm just saying it's worth investing in these kind of public infrastructure things because they come back around. These crises tend to recur. Anyway, we'll have more Rising for you right after this.